All right, thanking and praising God for the way in which, if we haven't said it recently, the way that He helps us set healthy standards, often rooted in humility. Understanding that, let's look at chapter 12 of John's Gospel that talks about His triumphal entry, but not before. It talks about a dinner that Martha and Mary are going to throw after Jesus has raised their brother Lazarus from the dead in the last chapter, helping us to see that in the first 8 verses, not only do they put on that dinner, they end up falling into what seem to be familiar roles, not only for Martha and Mary, but also for Judas, even though his role is going to seem to be a little more low key. But it's going to say that Martha served, as we have seen her in previous stories, at least in previous gospels, where there's a little bit of a disagreement, it seemed, between Martha, who was serving, and Mary, who was not helping because she was listening to Christ teach. Christ helping Martha to understand that Martha might have been worried too much about serving and not enough about the hearing, which Mary was doing. But it's not all bad, because it seems that Martha's tendency to want to serve is in line with one of the things that Jesus has told his apostles, or will tell them in the next chapter, which is they need to serve to the extent of being foot washers, something that seemed to be an exceedingly demeaning gesture or role in their culture. So she's not on the wrong path. Jesus' earlier story was simply helping her to redirect it in a healthy way, which she seems to be doing now, as they are seeming to show gratitude in their dinner for Lazarus, at which Martha is serving, and likewise Mary, not to be outdone, not that it's a competition, is going to seem to find a familiar role, understanding that she has already apparently anointed Jesus's feet and cleaned them or wiped them with her own hair. She's going to do that again, provoking Judas to fall into a low-key familiar role of overreacting over the expenditure of money, understanding that it wasn't exposed yet, but he was a thief, stealing from the common money bag. Therefore, seeing the expenditure didn't necessarily touch his heart for the waste of money that could have gone to the poor or any other cause than his own, understanding that every amount that she might have spent on Jesus was taken away from an amount that he would have been able to steal as the custodian of the Christ's money bag, or the collective money bag of the apostles. But with that, Christ, in the famous statement, is going to close out that section in the 8th verse, talking about the way that she's done a kindness that they won't always have the opportunity to do, even though they will frequently and once again have the chance to do kind things for the poor. Verses 9 through 11, going on to talk about the way that the buzz created around the resurrection of Lazarus is now going to not only attract large crowds, but the large crowds are going to attract, once again, the resentment of, this time, the chief priests, who are going to plan to kill Lazarus as well. Once again, piercing beneath the appearance that their problems with the Christ were primarily doctrinal and of some noble source or noble motivation. No, they're trying to kill Lazarus, and they don't have the least bit of a doctrinal problem with him. He is just evidence of the kindness that Christ is showing to the people, and the magnitude of the miracles or the effect that he's having on them. Understanding that, verses 12 through 19 are going to describe the triumphal entry, once again polarizing the people into those who, having seen what he has done for Lazarus, are going to praise him as essentially the Messiah, crying out, what is it? Verse 13, or in verse 13, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Once again, by the time we get to the end of that section, driving the Pharisees in verse 19 to say, so the Pharisees said to one another, see that you are gaining nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Once again, provoking their resentment, showing that it has nothing to do at its core with a doctrinal dispute or any kind of, as we said before, noble cause, anything beyond their own wounded egos, it would seem, in my paraphrase. In verse 20, though, going on through verse 26, it's going to seem that understanding that the Passover drew people from the diaspora, meaning the Hebrews who had been driven to different places. It seems that there are some Greeks, quite possibly Greeks who were Hebrews as well, but they lived in Greece. They came through wanting to see Jesus, but as visitors to Jerusalem at this time, they seem to be caught in the middle of the growing friction between the Christ, the Pharisees, the chief priests, etc., as they're going to ask to see him, but he's going to seem to answer them in a way that helps them understand that whatever it was that they came to see, whether it was the miracles, the teachings, or whatever, those are going to be a part of his past as he is setting his face towards his sacrifice on the cross. Talking about the way that it has practical value. Understanding that unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth, in verse 24, it just remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit, helping us to rationally understand the benefit of his death. Still, there is the emotional anguish of the injustice that we'll see in verses 27 through roughly 36, where he's going to say, now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose, I have come to this hour, understanding that he is going to embrace his responsibility, once again, putting it into perspective for others in verse 32. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself, understanding that his focus in his life was in ministering directly to the people of Israel. Once again, as the prophet said, Israel was to be a light to the world, understanding that they were showing people of all nations the way back to reconciliation with God at their best. But right now, there is the friction within Israel that will not allow them to listen to the Christ who is literally showing them the way back. And so his sacrifice is going to be the way in which he draws all people to himself. Understanding that in verses, 36 on through 43. He is going to, and that question really, before we get to that set of verses, the fact that he is saying he will be lifted up seems to mark a point at which at least some understand he is talking about his death and sacrifice, prompting them to question, if he's the Christ, it says the Christ remains forever. He's saying whether or not you really understand what that passage means, understand that the time that you will have the light of his teaching and his presence among you is growing short. So make the most of it while it is available. But that is still going to leave some dissatisfied to the point where, in spite of now in verses 36 through 43, in spite of all of the things that he has done, some are unable to get over the differences they see between the life of Jesus and what they are expecting in the Christ, leaving him to quote Isaiah in a familiar passage we've seen in the other Gospels, skipping to verse 40, where he says, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and he would heal them. Nevertheless, verse 41 is going to remind us of that theme of the division that his presence drives amongst the people, saying that even some of the rulers believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. That's verse 42, going on to verse 43, where it says, for they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God, leading to the end of the chapter that motivated me to think that the best theme might be standards, where he is going to say, whatever you think of his presence, the words that he has spoken are going to be the objective standard by which all people are going to be judged, understanding that the relative or competing opinions about his ministry and the standards that he has set don't matter as much as whether or not they are consistent with the things that God has said, making it incumbent upon them and all of us to beg God to help us to, once again, diligently seek truth so that we are prepared for the day in which he holds us accountable according to the things that he has said. Reminding me of the thing that might have most caught my attention in this chapter, and that is the way that by all objective standards, those who are least qualified to speak on a subject far too often are the most confident or even condescending in speaking on it. Understanding that Judas was the least qualified to speak on Mary's use of money, understanding that Judas was stealing money. And then likewise, by the time we get to the end of the chapter, the Pharisees were so fixated on Jesus not being the Christ that they had become the least qualified to actually see who the Christ was. However, they were not only condescending, but controlling over those who were able to effectively put the facts together to come to the truth. that the things Jesus had been doing did actually fit the description of the Christ. Understanding that, it reminds me, or this situation reminds me of at least two things. One, the fact that in Jude's epistle, a one-chapter epistle, he talks about this phenomenon pointing forward, even beyond this history that we're seeing of the relationship between Jesus and Judas and the scribes and Pharisees. He's pointing forward to what we can expect as people, as disciples, and that is what he calls blemishes on our love feast. Meaning, in life, we are not in the perfected kingdom of God, and so we can expect adversity even in the midst of our gatherings as God's people. And so it's like what Christ said in his own set of parables in chapter 13 of Matthew, where he talked about the wheat and the tares, good seed planted by God, sown over by weeds that are growing up or that grow up amongst the good seed. And so with that, what's the practical response? Well, and what we see here in John chapter 12, it seems that we have to have the courage to overcome the discouragement that is often woven in even amongst God's people. And beyond just generally having courage, reminded me of what Christ said in chapter 8, maintaining the courage to continue to seek truth, understanding that Christ literally in chapter 8 said, the truth will set you free. Understanding that the Pharisees were able to control those who were approaching a closer relationship with God by redefining what was acceptable. My prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, can you please help us desire and maintain the courage to continue to seek truth so that we can truly be free of the artificial boundaries far too often imposed upon us by the expectations and the approval of others.